Welcome everyone to the June edition of WATAC Presents Women and the Diaconate with guests Reverend Sandy Boyce and Elizabeth Young. I'm Danielle Lynch, Secretary of WATAC and your host for this session. WATAC Presents is a project of Women and the Australian Church, WATAC, an incorporated organisation that commenced in 1984 to promote women's role in the Australian Church. We're Catholic in origin, ecumenical in practice and inclusive in our membership. Welcome to WATAC Presents. This meeting is being held on Aboriginal lands across Australia. We respect and honour Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders, past, present and future. We acknowledge the stories, traditions and living cultures of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of these lands and commit to building a brighter future together. I'm on the lands of the Gubbi Gubbi people, north of the place we call Brisbane. I invite you to name into the chat the peoples on whose lands you reside or are today. A few protocols then before we begin. WATAC are committed to making this event accessible and productive for everyone. Please take a moment to have a look at the protocols on the screen for this evening's Zoom. During the course of our discussions this evening, difficult questions, difficult issues may be raised, and it's important that you feel safe at all times. And if you need to take a break, please do so. We'll also show on the screen some places and organisations where you can go for support. WATAC's not a space in which we can support disclosures or provide ongoing assistance, although some WATAC members will remain at the end if anyone wants to have a conversation with the WATAC team. But I encourage you to use the resources available on the screen should you need to. We're going to begin this session with a prayer led by our speakers before I introduce them to you. So Elizabeth, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Dan. So I'd like us all to take some moments to just breathe. And we're coming a few days after Pentecost. And the word for spirit is also the word for breath and the word for wind. So we'll just take a few quiet moments to breathe and to become aware of our breath. And as the Holy Spirit breathes through us, moves through us, may it inspire us, may we be filled with the gifts of the Spirit, the fruits of the Spirit. May we give that life and energy and goodness, animation in our world. And may we do this in the name of Jesus, who lived and died, rose again, and sent his Spirit to fill our lives with hope and joy and with the life of God. Amen.
Amen. This session is on women and the diaconate. Elizabeth and Sandy will be discussing what difference the diaconate makes in the church and the difference ordaining women into this ministry makes. This is particularly relevant to the Catholic Church's Plenary Council, particularly as Motion 54 says, this Plenary Council commits the Church in Australia to overcoming the impact of the assumptions that lead to inequality and to enhancing the role of women in the church. This will involve women engaged in ministry sharing their experience and reflections on women's ministry with our bishops and reporting to Pope Francis's reconstituted study commission on the female diaconate and considering women for ministry as deacon should Pope Francis authorize such ministry in light of the findings of this study. So let me introduce you to our two speakers. Elizabeth Young, who has discerned a calling to be a deacon in the Catholic Church, and Reverend Sandy Boyce, an ordained deacon in the Uniting Church, who will explore this topic of women in the diaconate from theological, experiential, and practical perspectives. Reverend Sandy Boyce is a deacon in the Uniting Church in Australia. She was in ministry in a city congregation in Adelaide from 2009 to 2021, with a primary focus on engaging the church and the community. And she's recently commenced a new role as executive officer in the Victorian Council of Churches. She offers leadership in the diaconate of the Uniting Church in Australia. Sandy continues to seek opportunities to enhance the understanding of diaconal ministry in the church generally and encouraging the whole people of God to live out their own diaconal ministry. Elizabeth Young grew up in rural South Australia in the Uniting Church, where her father was a lay preacher and her mother ran the Sunday school. Through her school, she joined the Catholic Church, and at a young age, influenced by the good leaders she had in both churches, men and women, felt called to ordained ministry. She was professed a Sister of Mercy in 2010 and is currently a diocesan pastoral worker and chaplain in a Catholic secondary college in New South Wales. So welcome, Sandy and Elizabeth. This first 20 minutes, we will have some conversation between us. I'll ask some questions to our speakers. We'll have 10 minutes after that, where we'll go off into breakout rooms to discuss what is speaking to us, what the Spirit is saying through this meeting. And we'll come back with an opportunity for you participants to pose questions to our two speakers. So I wonder, Sandy, if I could begin with a question to you. Can you tell me something about the history of the diaconate in the Uniting Church in Australia?
Well, firstly, thank you for having me here. It means a lot. Elizabeth and I go back a long way, and it's a pleasure to be with her and with all those on the screen. So thank you for having me. Some of the history, obviously, we could talk for hours about the history, but enough to say that the Uniting Church is made up of Presbyterian, Methodist and Congregational churches that came together in 1977. There were deaconesses before in those churches, and some of them were looking after their own church, some of them were missionaries, a whole range of different things. In preparation for church union in 1977 and the basis of union, that was the way those churches agreed to get together, it was agreed that they would not have any more deaconesses. So those who were already deaconesses could continue on, but they wouldn't have any more. And so 1977 church union, and then it took until 1991 until they finally agreed to the renewal of the diaconate. So it's a mighty long time. Part of the questions, it had to be approved at the National Assembly, which is once every 3 years. And so there were endless reports and presentations and counter arguments. The arguments of, well, should deacons be allowed to do sacraments, you know, and for us it's communion, baptism, etc. So surely that's what ministers of the word or priests would be doing. So why would we need deacons? Could deacons just be a lay ministry rather than ordained ministry? And who would pay deacons if they're going to be working in the community rather than the church? Who's going to pay them? So it was all those kind of questions and objections, many objections. It took a very long time for consensus to be found. It was always assumed that it would be men and women who would be part of this new renewal of the diaconate. The renewal of the diaconate was happening all around the world at that kind of time in the second half of the last century. but there were two men who decided they'd take matters into their own hands, Bill and David, and they candidated to be deaconesses. If they're going to take forever, well, we'll be a deaconess. So this was before church union. But so we had Deaconess Bill and Deaconess David, which is a lovely confronting thing for the church to have to deal with, like, oh, we better get a move on with this. So the history was 1991, it was agreed. 1992, the first acknowledgements and ordinations. So in a nutshell, that's it. But it was highly, highly contentious. And if I may just add this last part, it continues to be. And it's contested all the way. Even now, we continue to have the same arguments of 30 years ago about formation and training and recognition and why do we need these deacons. So yeah, that's a little of the history.
All right, thanks, Sandy. And in contrast, Elizabeth, where's the Catholic Church at in discussions around women in the diaconate?
Yes, thanks, Dan, and thanks, Sandy. It's really good to hear that story. The history of the diaconate for women in the Catholic Church is actually influenced by the renewal of the diaconate for men, as well, as you were talking about. And actually Protestant churches in Germany in particular in the last half of the 19th century. So after some time of discussion in Germany in particular among Catholics, and then in particular in the World War II, in the Dachau concentration camp, there was a lot of discussion among some of the priests there. There was a man called Hannes Kramer, and he started diaconal circles after the Second World War in Germany with both men and women who were doing diaconal ministries. And so there was discussion there, but not just in Germany. Actually, when the Vatican Council happened in the 1960s, hundreds of bishops from around the world called for a renewal of the permanent diaconate. The diaconate never disappeared from the Catholic Church exactly, but it went from the permanent diaconate to the transitional diaconate only for men who are preparing to become priests. So the call was for renewal of the permanent diaconate. And what was said, at least, was it wasn't because of a shortage of priests, but because of a shortage of deacons. So to really recognize this as a significant order, or a historical, traditional order of the church that had been lost, and a real sense of a need for that connection between the life of the world and the life of the church. And how can we prevent what happened in World War II happening again through the church's influence in the world? How can we better serve the world and help connect that to the church as an institution? So there was a whole lot of conversations happening. Apparently two of those bishops who put submissions towards the Second Vatican Council talked about women as well, but at the Vatican Council it was restored as a permanent diaconate only for men. So that was a significant movement, though, after many hundreds of years of no permanent deacons. And then since then, there has been the conversation about women in diaconate. It's kept coming up. Pope Paul brought it up. And then the International Theological Commission spent 10 years studying the diaconate as a whole from 1992 to 2002, and then released a document at the end of that. And they put several paragraphs all about women in the diaconate in the past. But when it came to the present, they said, well, we'll leave it for the magisterium to decide. We don't have a definitive answer about that. So it was left in the air in 2002. And then there was some significant changes that happened with Pope John Paul II and then Pope Benedict to the Catechism and then canon law, which made more of a distinction in the sacrament of orders between the presbyterate and the diaconate, which actually will be significant for the theological discussions in the future. The deacon is called to serve the word, liturgy and charity, and priests are called to represent Christ the head. So there was a distinction made there, which made some of the arguments perhaps not disappear because they're still happening there, but the arguments about why aren't we having women as deacons, made some of those arguments defunct, because we're really talking about two different things here, as in presbyterate and diaconate. And then when it came to this present Pope, Pope Francis, he was put the question by a group of religious congregational leaders or superiors as to, well, can't we look at this question, women in the diaconate, many women doing these kinds of ministries, and how could they be strengthened by sacramental grace as the men were? So the Pope commissioned a group of people to look at the question, but unfortunately that didn't come to any firm conclusions, and he disbanded that group after some time, a couple of years. But the Synod on the Amazon happened, and a very strong call came from that, again, to reopen that question. And the Pope again has commissioned a group of people to look at the question of women in the diaconate, and that's ongoing at the moment. We don't know where that's up to. In the Australian Church, I think there hasn't been so much discussion publicly in the more recent past, at least. But very exciting to see, as we've heard about the Plenary Council and one of the motions, number 54, watch out for that one, because there's 2 points there that speak specifically about women in the diaconate. And that's come up in the proposals that were put out publicly, and something that a group of people and myself have been trying to raise as a public conversation in Australia.
So we live in hope on that one. And I think what we get is a clear sense that both of you have an understanding of the importance of the diaconate as a ministry in its own right, as a way in which the church can be served by women and men. Sandy, I wonder if you could tell me something about the current status of the diaconate at an international level in the Uniting Church.
In the Uniting Church or at an international?
At an international level, however you want to.
Okay, so let me tackle it this way by saying that it's many and varied. So when we have our assembly, which technically is every 4 years when there's not COVID, and my first one, I was absolutely stunned because there are nurses in nurse uniforms who are deaconesses. There are deacons who are more like priests wearing their collars and stoles. There are, it's many and varied. So there are some deaconesses, say in Fiji, who were only ever, I'll rephrase that, who were commissioned but were seen as second rate to, of course, the more important ordained people. Now they're ordained themselves as deaconesses. We have the Lutheran Deaconess Association in America that's had to change its name because now it's open to men as well. So it's the Lutheran Deacon Association. We know, and Elizabeth alluded to this as well, there are permanent deacons, there are transitional deacons. That I know in the Anglican Church in South Africa, the bishops don't support the deacons at all. They'd rather they all went away. And one of the Anglican bishops in England actually, of his own volition, because you can do this if you have bishops, Uniting Church doesn't have this, but the bishop decided he would do away with the entire deacon association. So all the deacons were no longer deacons. Wow. Some deacons around the world are commissioned / ordained into roles. They might be nurses, they might be social workers, but they're recognised as doing something that resonates with diaconal ministry, so they are acknowledged as deacons or deaconesses. So it's many and varied. They all have to undergo study and formation. So you have, you might have a nurse who's recognised as a deacon who's done perhaps 3 years of theological study in addition to their vocational training. One of the big things, I think, is the inclusion of men in the diaconate. So in some ways, what Elizabeth is bringing is kind of the opposite side of the coin to what has been, because, and Elizabeth mentioned about in 1836, Theodor Fliedner, who was a Lutheran pastor in Germany, who things were very tough. and lots of social problems, people coming into the city, diseases spread, blah, blah, blah. So, and all these women who were not allowed to work, but if they lived in a mother house, then they could be recruited to serve in all kinds of ministry with children, with nursing, and Florence Nightingale actually did part of her training in a diaconal association in Kaiserswerth in Germany. So that's the model of women was very, very strong, and now it's open to men and women. I think, just to finish off, I think one of the other big movements is, and John Collins, who's a Catholic theologian, has helped do some thinking about this, that deacons, it was always assumed they'd be waiting on tables and they'd be subservient and let me serve you, and people will sometimes mock, oh, Sandy can do that because she's a deacon, she can clear the table. And of course, in some churches, that's actually what it does mean, like go and pack the chairs up. But John Collins and others have been unpacking, what if it's actually not about subservient service, but because the early deacons were also pastors, preachers, the whole lot. So a much more dynamic understanding about diaconal ministry. So it might be that deacons are prophets and pastors, that they're catalysts for change, that they're justice, advocates for justice or pioneers in ministry, etc. So a much more dynamic understanding of diaconal ministry, not a kind of passive, subservient understanding. So that's quite a big change.
Such a broad range of experiences and ways in which deacons can serve that I'm hearing across the world.
Yes.
And Elizabeth, we've heard about your calling in your bio, your experience of that calling to ministry. What's your experience of ministry in that sense?
Thanks. Actually, hearing from Sandy some of those expressions of diaconal ministry around the world, some of them look similar to religious life or consecrated life. And I think that's a really interesting conversation and aspect of this, something Dr. Phyllis Sagano, who's written a lot about women in the diaconate, she talks about that a lot, in that there have been very strong expressions of people living out their religious commitment through a professed religious life, doing these things, studying theology as well. And it is becoming less in the world today. And what do young people look up to as a way of committing their life in totality? So this might be one expression of that in the future. So for myself, I guess I've been just so privileged and fortunate. I've been very blessed, and I think I come to this from a sense of being privileged rather than being denied things, because through the Holy Spirit, it's the only way I can say it, I've ended up doing many of these things which look very similar to diaconal ministry. And that's not because I've pushed for it, but it's just kept coming back no matter what I've done, or something hasn't worked out, and wow, I get thrown into something which looks similar to what a deacon might do. But I think what I've come to understand, so through my experience as I did youth ministry, chaplaincy in prisons and detention centres, nursing homes, hospitals, pastoral associate work, pastoral worker now, and our chaplain in a school. And I think I came to think, well, what difference would it make if I were ordained, or if someone like myself were ordained? Why would that be a positive or an advance, or how would that help those I minister to? And because I think one thing as a sister of mercy, and again, I've been so privileged to be part of this wonderful group of women, but there is a difference in having a public profession in a mass with a bishop. There's a different relationship that you have with other people, and that's how often ordination is described. There's a change in your relationships with others, and there's a sense of being part of something much bigger. When you speak with the whole of the Sisters of Mercy, the whole of, for some people, the sisters, for some people, the church, but you represent something much bigger, and that can be a very serious responsibility. And it can also be a real privilege. It can be a way in that's much, much easier than for lay people in a similar position to mine. And I've really seen that as a Sister of Mercy, also often seen as less of a threat to ordain clergy because you're part of something stable and recognised and all of that. But at the same time, you're not part of the hierarchy. You're not a member of the clergy. You don't attend clergy meetings. In some places, maybe they do, but you're not in that hierarchy. I know that can be a difficult term for a lot of people, but at the same time, I've been working for bishops. So in a way, I know what it's like. In some ways, that my bishop is my direct supervisor in my role at the moment. So it wouldn't be a big change in that sense to become a deacon. But I think the thing that I came to, and that's how I started the blog called Liturgy on the Margins, was that becoming a deacon enables liturgy as a particular way of being present to people, a particular way of enabling our faith journeys, enabling people in life in so many aspects through liturgy, but in marginal spaces, in marginal times of people's lives. And I think we've seen that in the Uniting Church. I know they talk about the scattered community, those who are maybe not in the gathered community. But a deacon has that opportunity to reach out in the name of the church using liturgy in a way that's public, that's authorised. The people that you're ministering to have that reassurance that you've done training, you've done formation, you have supervision, you've committed your life to this. It's not a transitional thing. It's not a provisional thing, just until the real person shows up. So I think that's where it really adds. I think, again, I've been privileged because being a sister, I think you have some of that when you're going to people. But I've been in the same kind of ministry, for example, in prisons, leading liturgies or just doing pastoral care. And wow, the difference that liturgy makes. There's just something that happens. It's really powerful in that space of liturgy that you can be with the same people, but there's something new there. And there's something that's, particularly when it's that liturgy liturgy is what's recognised by the church. It's using the formats that are used worldwide. It's not something made up on the spot. We can all do prayer services. There's no issue with that. But there is an issue with doing the formal public authorised liturgy of the church.
It's a really interesting perspective there on the difference that it makes, the ordination. At this point, we'll just take a time to pause and reflect, to think about what we've heard so far, what's resonating with us, and what's challenging us. And we're going to zoom off into breakout rooms for 10 minutes. You'll be with a group of about 4 people. Once you've introduced yourself, you might want to share some of those resonances or challenges amongst your group, have a conversation for 10 minutes, maybe think of some questions that you want to put to Elizabeth and Sandy when we come back, and then you'll be whisked back here in 10 minutes time. So Tracy's going to send us off into breakouts. Well, welcome back to the main room, everyone. I trust that you've had some good, fruitful conversations and you've come back full of questions to put to Sandy and Elizabeth. I might just begin with a question while you're typing yours into the chat. Sandy, would you mind starting off telling us what have been the contributions of deacons to the Uniting Church in Australia?
So I'll try and keep it very brief. Let me begin by saying in 1977 at Church Union, there was a statement to the nation, you know, the grand, here we are, this is who we say we are with this new church. And it said things like, we pledge ourselves to seek the correction of injustices wherever they occur. We will work for the eradication of poverty and racism within our society and beyond. We'll affirm the rights of all. You get the idea. It was full of those kind of aspirational longings as a church, and to say who we are as the Uniting Church. It's a fantastic, encourage you to look at it. But deacons are those who, in a sense, embody some of those aspirations through their ministry. It's the work of the whole church, but deacons can be a catalyst for enabling people. So the question about the contribution of deacons in the Uniting Church, I wanted to say that it's not so much what deacons themselves do. In other words, it's my ministry and here's what I do, but more deacons are those who resource, encourage, enthuse, equip, etc., others, the whole people of God, to be engaged in diaconal ministry. So that's a difference, so that the whole church is released to be engaged in the community. Having said that, deacons have been engaged in various chaplaincy, hospitals, prison, all those kind of things, schools ministry, working in congregations, working with Aboriginal people, etc., etc. So, and my current position as an ecumenical person in the Victorian Council of Churches, justice work, all that sort of thing. So it's a very broad canvas for deacons and what they do, but for me the most important thing is to be equipping others, encouraging others to be engaged in, because it's the ministry of the whole people of God. So thank you.
Great. And there's a great question come into the chat, and Elizabeth, I might put it to you first, but Sandy, feel free to jump in at any point. These questions in the chat, we'll just have a conversation around them, so feel free to jump in. Elizabeth, why do you think there's so much resistance to women deacons?
That's a good question, and something that probably goes back a very long way. We go back all the way to the Bible, of course, the female deacon, St. Phoebe. But right from the early church, there started to be resistance to women in ministry in lots of different ways. So it goes back a very long way. There's some things, particularly around the 12th century, that were said, and also earlier to that, the whole idea of impurity laws and who can approach the holy. And because women have menstruation, therefore they're not able to approach the sanctuary or the holy. Fortunately, we've just recently had, very recently, had women being allowed to be acolytes, which proves that they are allowed to approach, to enter the sanctuary, to touch the holy. But I think the 12th century, as I mentioned, there was some things written that became very influential in canon law from then on. And one was the idea that women couldn't be ordained, and even if they were ordained, it wouldn't they wouldn't be able to receive the ordination. So even if they went through the whole procedure, as women had been doing up until then, it wouldn't take. And then there became the whole idea that women never had been ordained in the past, never could be, and never would be in the future. So that was a very strong idea. And the other words that were said at that time was the impediment of sex. So that women had this impediment of sex, and that's why they would not be able to be ordained. So some of those ideas were very strong and continue to be very strong. So I think some of that is still behind even preaching here today. So I think that it's a very difficult thing to overcome, I guess. But I think also one thing is that there can be a lot of arguments from a very theoretical point of view. I would really encourage you to ask the people that are in the nursing home that I've led the liturgy in for today, are in the tiny little parish. Those people, because when you're desperate for a liturgical space, for affirmation, for witness, for coming together as a community, for being empowered as lay people, that speaks for itself. And I think that when it comes from a real experience, it's different than a theoretical idea about why women shouldn't be deacons.
And the patriarchy is alive and well, hey? And there's a comment in the chat about how it's that kind of slippery slope argument, or on the way to full ordination if we allow them to be deacons. Sandy, did you want to add anything to that, why people have such distaste for women deacons?
Well, it's an argument that's long been won in the Uniting Church. When in the Uniting Church, for a minister, as part of their ordination vows, they actually have to agree to the ordination of men and women, like, you know, that there is no differentiation, that ministry is open to all. So it's actually a foundational thing for the Uniting Church. Now, having said that, there are congregations who won't have a female minister, who, you know, like, it still persists. They just get around it another way. So, and I think it is, we have to do a lot more unpacking of the fear and theology that goes with women being somehow, as Elizabeth said, impure, temptress, you know, all those kind of things. We have to keep unpacking that, because people I don't think they're aware of just how ingrained it is to view women in this way, and we have to keep unpacking that. So men and women together. It shouldn't just be women having to advocate for. It should be men and women all advocating that we all, and somebody's written in there about charisms, you know, like we all have charisms from, and it's not differentiated by sexuality, you know, whether you're male or female. What are the charisms that can be brought into ministry?
Yeah, so if we underpinned it with a theological anthropology that recognized the dignity of all people regardless of gender and sexuality, then you know, we would have a far greater pool of people from which we could draw for such ministries.
Yes.
Yeah, great, thanks. And another question about the role of deacons in the Australian church. What is the role going to be in the future, or into the future as we currently stand, for men and women who are called and ordained into the role of deacon?
Yes, thanks. I think that's a really good question and conversation, because as part of this discussion that I've been trying to generate, and our group has been trying to generate since last year, the wonderful thing has been to talk to a lot of permanent deacons, the men who are currently deacons in Australia in the Catholic Church, and to hear their vision and their hopes and their challenges. I think some of the challenges Sandy's talking about, they feel that too. It can be really difficult. Some dioceses have deacons, some don't. Some have men prepared for the diaconate and they're not ordained, and things like that. So I'm hoping that this will be a conversation for the whole church in Australia, for men and women, and to really help us understand the value of the diaconate in itself. And even to have something about the diaconate at the plenary council is really important, both for men and for women. So yes, I think the vision is probably still being developed in a lot of ways, but for the diaconate to really have a solid grounding, a real true value in itself, the word, the liturgy and charity, they're the three main aspects which have been noted in canon law. But how that looks in reality, and it looks different in different dioceses. But someone said to me recently, we're not just a liturgical fill. You wouldn't want the diaconate just to be limited to the liturgical ministries. As Sandy's been talking about, it's that whole witness of service in a whole lot of different ways, but not just service, prophecy, advocacy, you know, living the Christian faith in a whole lot of different experiences, but making that connection between that and the church. So I think that's something that we're building on at the moment.
Andy, I might add a dimension to the question before I put it to you. And thinking about the language we use, the deacon, is that problematic? Is there a better way we can express this ministry? Is deacon the language we should be using to describe this ministry going forward, do you think?
Is that a question for me? Sorry. So I think the word deacon is layered with lots of different understandings. So deacons in the congregational church were literally the people who they could be like the elders or equivalent. Deacons in the Baptist church are those who move the furniture and, you know, do the kind of hack work. It's got a whole lot of different meanings, and I think the term is actually quite problematic. And I know that in Canada they call the deacons diaconal ministers. So they establish that these are ministers who have done theology. Just to pick up your point, Elizabeth, about, you know, to recognise that there's training that's happened, formation and so on. But it also states it's diaconal. It's a kind of almost an action word, isn't it? Diaconal ministers. It's rather than deacon. So maybe there's other language we can explore that picks it up, because Elizabeth has already named some of these, but, you know, the prophet, the catalyst, you know, a whole range of different words that describe what deacons do, and the word deacon may not quite sum it up enough.
And we've mentioned a lot of the countries in the developed world and their approach to deacons. I wonder, is there a role for deacons in the developing world?
Well, there's a number it's an interesting question. There's actually quite a growth of male deacons in Africa. But culturally, the word deacon, if you're a deacon, it's seen as second rate. Culturally, you have an overlay of culture on it. It actually makes it even more third rate. You're not engaged in ministry. I won't say capital M, but you're not engaged in proper ministry. And culturally, the hierarchy is seen as very important in Africa, in the Pacific, and so on. So, but there are growing numbers of both male and female, but especially male deacon associations in Africa.
Mm. And Elizabeth, do you have hope? Do you see potential for deacons in the Catholic Church? And what happens if that is denied to women going into the future? What is the future for young women in the church if that's not the case?
Yes, I think, two difficult questions. Do I have hope? Of course I have hope, because we're Christians and we have a Christian hope. And I think the Holy Spirit is working in this. I really do. And I think there is a movement, and particularly things with like the Synod on the Amazon. There was so much movement there. When it might happen, who knows, and who the leader might be that makes that decision, who knows. Of course, if it happens, there'll be a lot of steps after that, as it happened for the male permanent diaconate. So a bishop's conference would have to agree to it in their area, and then individual bishops would have to agree to it. Discernment, formation, all of that. So none of this is a quick process, and I'm very aware of that. But of course, I do have hope. And the second part of that question was about, if it's not allowed, which is a very, very interesting question. And just as I said, for young people, here in our school, they had a number of conversations around the plenary council. And when the young people were asked, what they would like to see in the church, what do they think the Spirit's calling the church to, it was the boys who said a more gender equal church. Mm. So they were the ones that really didn't see themselves having a place in a church that didn't have a diversity of leadership. So I think it would be a very sad thing for the church. I don't think the diaconate is a be-all and the end-all at all. I think there's many, many different kinds of charisms, callings, ministries, and I don't want to put down or not appreciate the many different callings people have. I actually think at the moment, I don't know that there would be hundreds of people signing up if it were the case that women could be deacons in Australia. I think people should stop being afraid of that, because it's a very specific calling, and it's something as male permanent deacons, you just know it's your calling. You know it's not your calling to be a catechist. You know it's not your calling to be a lay pastoral associate. It's something quite deep, and that might not be, at least initially, there might not be hordes of people who feel that call. But part of that is maybe having never seen anyone in those positions to have an example. But yeah, so I don't think the diaconate is the only question. There's so many other things about ministry that we should be looking at, but it's just something that for me and for others like me is something that's really significant for us.
And as Joan Chittister said on Friday night in Brisbane, the kids aren't dumb, that's why they're not there. I think the kids can teach us so much. Though she also did say that it might take 400 years for the church to recognize women's ordination, but we won't dwell on that too much. I wonder if we could put a final question to both of you about the culture that's in place, the clericalism that goes on within church institutions, and what safeguards and culture do we need to ensure we don't replicate that sort of culture, the worst aspects, as it were, of the church institutions.
Can I just say, Jodie, whoever you are there, hello. Great questions. Thank you. Not sure I'm adequate to answer them, but great questions. Thank you. I was thinking before that the question about the diaconate needs to be put in the context of what we do this whole church thing for in the first place. And so we go to church. No. We are church. Us. We're the church. And we gather to pray, to worship, to encourage each other, to tell our stories, blah, 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 what's God been up to. And then we're dispersed. And it's in the dispersal that the diaconal ministry is amplified. So if everybody saw themselves as gathering, and then they're scattered, and then they embody the Spirit of God in wherever they are in the community, it changes it from being like a deacon order and the risks of, as Jodie's pointed out, of clericalism and status and control and power and all that. It changes it to deacons are those who are encouraging the dispersal and gathering the stories when people come back again, that rhythm between the two. So if we treat it simply as here's another order, and now I have status, that's not a good way to see it. I'll just say, I think I've said enough, but I think we have to reimagine what church is about so that we can get the most dynamic way of being church and not, a structural hierarchy, that status and power. Yeah.
Elizabeth, any final words from you?
Oh, yes, just to add to that, I think it's always good to look at best practice and where we see that actually being really well addressed, a clericalist culture. And for me, I see that really in religious orders, men and women. But there was a very strong clericalist culture in the past. Sisters were, bowed down to almost. And I think there's a lot of hard work being done, particularly since Vatican II, in changing that. In our formation, I was so blessed. Like, it was very strongly inculcated into us a way of not being above others, not being any holier than anyone else, that it's about encouraging and empowering everyone. A whole lot of work was done from everybody. That change of culture took everybody. It took the leadership, it took all those part of the order as well. And I think that can be done. We've seen that in different spaces and places. And it's a challenge for the whole church. How can we do that together and change that culture together? And hopefully bringing people in of more diversity can help, and different professional backgrounds, for example, who have that as part of their own experience.
Amazing. And we could have this conversation for at least another hour. I get the sense that there's so much more we could unpack here. There are probably so many more questions that those of you out there have still got to put to these speakers. But I would just love to thank Elizabeth and Sandy for sharing the wisdom with us and engaging in such incredible, enriching conversation around deacons and the role that they have in an inclusive church. And that goes to the heart of what we are at WATAC. So those of you out there getting engaged in the conversation, please join WATAC if you're not already a member. We'd love to have you as part of our community. Elizabeth would like to share a flyer for an event with you before we wrap up.
Thank you. So this is an event that our group, the Australian Catholics Exploring the Diaconate, are preparing for September. It's celebrating the very first deacon named in the Bible, St. Phoebe. And that will be on Saturday, the September the 3rd. And you've got the details there. You can screenshot it or some way to record the registration, but we'll be trying to share that word between now and September. We have the amazing Dr. Phyllis Sagano speaking, as well as our own Australian expert on the diaconate, Professor and Deacon Anthony Cooley. Thank you.
Very well worthwhile. And I'll send that out in the next WATAC email, and we'll put that up on the Facebook group as well, so you'll have access to it there. Thank you so much, Elizabeth and Sandy, for coming and joining, talking to us. You have such expertise in the area as well. And I know I personally have found it fascinating to have this conversation tonight.